quickly, we have, oh, sorry, I started there. Good morning, everybody. This is Bill Seitz, corporate broker for Alta Realty Group. I'm going to be leading the training this morning. Our marketing director, Kevin Lauren, is out recovering from a little material removed from his lip. And as most of you know, Kevin and I grew up surfing together over many, many years, and it's catching up with us these days. So I had my little surgery a couple years ago on my forehead, and Kevin unfortunately had to deal with a little bit of an issue yesterday with his lip. So the fun stuff about getting older, but off we go. Today we have a great training with Lauren Nowak, our all things compliance, all things file review, car forms, certified trainer, licensed, and TC guru. And so she'll be coming on today to review the NAR update, and we'll also go through all of the new forms releases. We're going to do this in a two-part series. And so today will be part one, and then we'll come back in a couple weeks and do part two. There's just too many forms to review and to go through in one shot, and I don't think all of us have the bandwidth to do that, but we will go through the major ones with Lauren this morning. So we're going to skip the mortgage update today, and I've got Courtney helping me in the background, so I appreciate your help this morning, Courtney. And if we could get Lauren on the call, we'll get right into it. Oh, there you are.
Hi.
Good morning, Lauren.
Hello. Yes. Thanks again for having me. And I apologize in advance. I think this will probably be maybe more of the chaotic ones that I've done because there have been so many changes last minute. Even as of 8 a.m. this morning, I had planned to utilize uh, the slides from the C.A.R legal webinar because those were more all-encompassing. And when they updated everything, they removed the slides. So now I've had to kind of scramble and put together my own version. So I apologize if it's a little jumpy here. So let me just take a second real quick. I want to share my screen,
Yeah,
clear out some
and
of this other stuff.
additionally, before we kind of get deep, well, yeah, we won't do the mortgage update today because Debbie's on vacation. So we're going to dedicate this whole time period to the forms
Yeah.
revisions and the updates. So it'll give us a little extra time on that end as well, and we'll come back to mortgage and market update next week. So yeah, so take it away, Lauren, and I'm going to be here interactive with you as I see fit.
Excellent. Let's see. I don't want to do full screen. Okay. Then, ooh, there are so many forms here. Okay, let me pull this up.
Can you share your screen or?
Yeah, I don't know where I think I shrunk. There we go. Okay. Share my screen. Okay. Woo. All right. I swear I've done this before. Okay, so everybody can see this, hopefully. These are our new and revised forms. And let's see here. So I just want to, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, a breakdown really quickly of the process for these new and revised forms, how you can find them, learn about them, all the forms that we're going to be discussing today, all the ones we're not going to be able to get to today. I'll jump through where to find those. Um, uh, all the forms that we're going to be discussing today are revisions of existing forms, with the exception of about 3 of them. There are 17 forms and concepts that require you to kind of restructure, reframe your approach, need a little bit more of a breakdown. 10 forms with kind of smaller tweaks and changes, but they're kind of big enough to note. And then there's 2 new forms that are available to kind of bridge the gap from now until August 17th rollout. And then we'll touch base real quick on and what is the coming weeks. So I will get into that. So first, the C.A.R Forms Committee, they meet multiple times throughout the year. They regularly review member feedback, and then obviously changes to the law, try to predict kind of upcoming changes, so on and so forth. And then they get together and they make these revisions and they release them twice a year in June and in December. This year has kind of been different in that we had some trickle out in May. We had some that are coming out, will be officially released for use in 2 weeks. And then obviously some that were the regular June release update. So to find those forms, you can go to car.org. You can go and new form releases. So just want to, walk you through really quick on how to get there. car.org. Let's see here. Let me share.
Lauren, while you're doing that, with in regards to the NAR update, they still are they're still finalizing that stuff, correct?
Yes. So today they released um uh the proposed changes. So we'll be able to see here where, let's see. Um uh they'll show us what they're gonna do or what those changes are, and then they're gonna actually release them in 2 weeks with those changes. So this is logging into car.org. You can see here right on the front page, they have right after this meeting at 10 a.m. they have a town hall where they're gonna go over some of the forms. They have them all week and next week. And again, I highly, highly, highly encourage everybody to check these out. They're going to answer questions. They're going to explain their process. They're rolling out additional trainings for forms trainers like myself on like how to explain these and teach these forms. Because in regards to the NAR settlement and all of those changes, it's going to be intense. It's a complete shift in how we're operating. So, well, that will be a separate webinar. In 2 weeks. But this is how you find the current changes and the proposed changes. You go here to the main login page. You go up here to Transaction Center. The default tab is the Transactions tab. You come over here to Standard Forms. From here, you can see there's a whole separate hyperlink for the settlement related forms, but the one that you typically will reference is the forms revisions and new form releases. Here is also a quick summary for the ones they just released today at 8 a.m. These show you, sign up for the town hall. When you click on these, it gives you all the changes and the red line versions of all the forms. But the ones that we're going to be touching on today are the ones that were just released in the June release at the end of the month. So from here, you can click on a summary guide, and this will break down each form and kind of a quick description of what was changed. This is not the most accurate summary because there are forms listed on this summary that were in relation to the NAR settlement that they ended up not releasing. So, but again, typically, this is the best reference for some of those changes, just kind of at a glance of like what are we looking at. And again, you can see there is an obscene amount of changes to all of these existing forms. And again, when you click on this hyperlink, it will take you to a file folder that you can download all of these documents, and you can see just at a glance. I'll show you just the cancellation form. It will give you just the red line version of the things that they've changed. So you don't have to like log into Zip Forms or Glide and pull up and try and figure it out. This version will give you the red line version. So you can see really quickly at a glance what has been changed and updated and so on and so forth. And then you can download them as well. So if you need reference to that, that is also available. The other thing that I want to point out as well is, let's see here. Will it let me go back? There we go. Okay. It doesn't open a new window. Any of these hyperlinks drives me crazy. It just opens, it's like in that same tab. So be careful, because if you close out the tab, you got to go all the way back and start over. So, okay. This is how you find the forms. You can also go to either this tab here on the right, that's risk management, or you can go back up to the transaction center and click on risk management. Either way, it will take you to this section of a couple of great resources. One, their C.A.R has a Legal Matters podcast, which is actually pretty interesting. They have a ton of different topics, not just on the new forms, but the new laws. It's more of like kind of a discussion. It's not just form specific, it's kind of situational. So that's a really good podcast. If you haven't done so, check that out. Whoops. See, again, it takes me the long way. The other thing that is available under risk management is under legal tools, and these are the quick guides. And these are really great because, again, they try to keep them to one page, but sometimes they have to go to two. But these are great, again, quick guides for not just specific documents, but kind of general approaches. So like E&O insurance, assigning contracts, a buyer request for repairs. So we could click on that. It'll tell you, kind of a Q&A of reference points and helpful information. Again, this is just one page breakdown. So these are super helpful. They have one, we'll get into this a little bit later, but these balcony inspection laws that are coming out January of next year, there's a quick guide on that. And this is going to be really helpful because that is another obnoxious law, almost like the home hardening, fire defensible space things of like, you need a map and a compass and something to like try and figure out how these all apply. So quick guides, really great. Again, they kind of gave you a version for the form updates as well. This is a little bit different than just the general summary. So that's available. And last but not least, again, under risk management, you have the legal live webinars. And these, not only do they have ones that you can kind of sign up for, again, they used to have all of them up here for the new forms trainings, and they removed all of these, but typically they're up here, but they also have all their past webinars. And not only do they have the recordings, they also have the handout forms, they have the slides available. So like everything is here that you could need. And then they give you kind of like the instant replay of the most recent ones as well. So C.A.R.org, Transaction Center, Risk Management, transactions, great resource for all of these new form things. Because again, I'm not going to be able to touch on everything today. Okay.
Yeah, I think for today,
yeah,
let's go through the big majors is what we'll call them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think 90% of us probably more or less are using the same forms. I mean, Obviously, not everything's apples to apples, but most transactions, as typically fall in at least, even if it's a single family versus a condo or versus, there's still more or less the same structure with the documents and disclosures. Um,
Right.
so yeah. Anyways,
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Um, so the first main big change on the purchase agreement is that the insurance element is now its own standalone contingency. So, and again, this also affects the 9 other purchase agreements. So it's a little daunting when CAR's like, we're revising 47 forms. It's like, well, okay, but like 9 of these are all getting the same update. So it's not as daunting and overwhelming. So just keep that in mind. But this applies to the residential income purchase agreement, vacant land, commercial, all those other purchase agreements. So again, the insurance contingency is now its standalone. It was previously included, and you can see now here 3L4 in the grid has it separated. It's now its own contingency. And that references paragraph 8D in the RPA, which is this tiny little paragraph. And it makes the agreement contingent upon the buyer's assessment of the availability and approval of the cost for any insurance policy desired under this agreement. So I'll say that again. This makes the agreement contingent upon the buyer's assessment of the availability, the buyer's approval of the cost for any insurance policy the buyer desires under this agreement. So that's a pretty broad requirement. But it's important, again, to remember that even though this is a standalone contingency, it can impact other contingencies, for example, that loan contingency. So you don't want to incorporate this or dismiss it as just like a smaller kind of side contingency, especially with issues with fire insurance and flood insurance and all this kind of stuff. So,
well,
um,
and Lauren, from what I see too, is a lot of times people wait to get their insurance policy
yeah,
till middle or the end of the transaction.
yep,
This is kind of a big deal,
yeah,
going on in the markets, the insurance markets for California. We know it's getting harder to get policies, or even people able to keep policies, and this is something you're going to want to be very, very mindful of, because this could be a big issue. If there's, if someone's having, if you know, getting started on this process is going to be very helpful to you.
yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
stages of the transaction, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And again, this also, they've incorporated this note or advisory element also into the BHIA, which is the Buyer Homeowner Insurance Advisory, which is bundled with the purchase agreement now. The BHAA, the Market Conditions Advisory, and then also the Non-Contingent Offer Advisory, that NCOA, which I think is with contingencies. It's a really important form that C.A.R released last update that highlights kind of the dangers and what they need to know, again, and how it relates to their ability to cancel on a transaction. Because you'll see here in paragraph 8A2, under the loan contingency, it specifies and it notes that the failure of the buyer to obtain insurance may justify cancellation based on the insurance contingency, but not on the loan contingency. So let's pop over to the contingency removal real quick. And again, this is kind of just a reminder that there are 9 individual possible contingencies and then a multiple combination available for removal of those specific contingencies, right? So you have a loan, you have appraisal, you have investigation, you have parts of the investigation. So all of the investigation, all except the physical inspection, um, uh, only the physical inspection, and then there's like a fill-in line. You now have insurance. You also have the review of all of the seller documents, which agents often incorporate into this investigation contingency, but it's not. It's separate. Review, that's not just HOA document or not HOA documents. That's any reports, previous transaction reports, anything that the seller, like a proof of signing authority, things like that, that the seller needs to provide their documentation for, that's incorporated into that specific standalone contingency. The review of the prelim is its own standalone contingency. And then your review of HOA documents, leased or liened items, solar, septic, anything like that. And then potentially if it's a buyer transaction. So this is one of the most common mistakes that I see agents make when advising not just their buyers on what to remove, but mostly mistakes that listing agents make when sending out a counteroffer. Because they'll just say, one drives me nuts. They'll say inspection contingency, to be 10 days or 5 days, or there is no inspection contingency on here. It's investigation, or it's really important to be specific. Once all contingencies are removed, whether or not the buyer has satisfied themselves regarding all contingencies or received any information relating to those contingencies, the buyer may not be entitled to a return of their deposit if the buyer doesn't close escrow. So this could happen even if, for example, the buyer doesn't approve of some aspect of the property or the lender does not approve of the buyer's loan. So it's really important to understand how each of these individual contingencies operate. So again, if a buyer removes, all except loan, and then like Bill was saying, you're waiting until the end to, or it's taken a really long time to get, homeowners insurance, whatever, that may be a lender requirement. And then it turns out that the buyer's not able to get that. The buyer cannot cancel based on the loan contingency. That is an insurance contingency that they had already removed. So again, their deposit may be at risk. And it's important to understand that even though one may affect the other, that they are standalone and separate. Okay.
Real quick, Lauren, the way
Yeah.
that reads to me is the buyer really has, like, if they don't like the cost of the policy, they can just cancel.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and to me, it could be maybe they wanted to get earthquake insurance. Maybe they wanted to get, like something that maybe isn't lender required, or, and so it's a really powerful, broad, I guess, out, but also can really screw over the buyer if they're not paying attention on what is getting removed. And you have to pay attention to what, the listing side is countering back. The seller side is saying, okay, we want these contingencies, removed, or, you know, even on the listing side to keep in mind when, we get a lot of situations where maybe the loan and appraisal contingencies are removed with the offer, and then we'll get a contingency removal for the investigation contingency. And then agents will be like, oh, all contingencies are removed. No, they're not. You now have insurance contingency, you have prelim, you have review of seller document. Like, you still have all these other contingencies. So it's really, really important to break that misconception that there are only three contingencies.
Yeah, there's two things that I'm thinking on this. Is one, like you said, it's very broad for the buyer to have any kind of excuse about either the cost of the policy, or like you said, earthquake, or flood zone, whatever it is. And the other thing is being super hyper careful of removing this contingency and not knowing for sure that the property is insurable. And you make that assumption, and then all of a sudden you've removed that, and you've kind of just assumed that, the loan looks good, everything looks good, blah blah blah. You're just assuming the insurance is going to be obtainable, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not. And now you're in a big pickle. You're in a big trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and again, I think a lot of times that specific element too, it's reminds me of that kind of Spider-Man meme of everybody pointing at each other, where it's like, oh, I thought escrow would have told me if the lender told escrow if there was a problem with insurance, or and it's like, who's who's responsible and accountable for that element. So again, you want to be aware of this specific aspect, and how it's so tempting in this market to just do a non-contingent offer, or say, okay, we're only going to keep our like loan contingency, or you want to have this enticing offer, or even on the seller side, you want to like, we're really going to lock in the buyer and make sure that like they're serious. And it's like, but you have to understand at whose risk you're doing that, because is it really in the seller's best interest if you try and box the buyer into a corner? Or maybe your seller knows that, like, yeah, it was really tough for us to renew our insurance last year or something, and you already know going into it um that there may be a delay. So it's just something that, as a transaction coordinator, I've seen so much in my business recently with agents and timelines in general, of just these crazy, crazy short compressed timelines that really are doing a disservice to both buyer and seller, in the name of wanting to be like enticing and serious. And it's like, no, this is a really big deal, and it's usually a lot of money on the line, and it's just not something that you can say like, oh, we're gonna have a 5-day contingency removal when you haven't even ordered HOA documents yet, or you haven't. So just keep these things in mind, because it's a really big deal. And again, it's a small, I mean, look, it's like not even 2 lines in this contract, but it's kind of broad. Okay. Any questions about that before I move on?
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on stuff
Okay.
that comes in.
So the other part in the purchase agreement is the section 7B. This talks about the condition of the property, and basically states that the seller, this talks about the seller's responsibility for holes. So 7B, the seller is not responsible to repair any holes left after the removal of any wall hangings, such as pictures and mirrors, brackets, nails, or other fast. I saw that and was like, that's conflicting information, because there's also another section in the contract that talks about the seller has to repair holes left by brackets. So the word bracket appears twice. Um, and I talked to the C.A.R attorneys, specifically during their training on this. And they said that their understanding is that it each references its own section of the contract. So this is talking about sort of the general wall condition, because later it's visual equipment. So here in 9C, this is where they're talking about brackets. Again, brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, or item will be removed, and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So again, this is one of those things where, because C.A.R's approach to the purchase agreement is to try and be as neutral as possible, and the purchase agreement can be used as a tool or a weapon depending on how you want to utilize it. It's really important to understand these ambiguities, because to me, it still seems like it can be conflicting. Because then you have the specific terms of uh, any such component or item, even though it's talking about in the items being excluded from the sale. Like, okay, this is just the things that the taking with them, or I don't know. It seems kind of vague to me. So I think everybody should kind of keep an eye on that and understand when you're talking with your seller and with the buyer of what those expectations are and making sure everybody's in agreement. Another note, the purchase agreement has gone from 16 to 17 pages because of some of the things that they've added in here. And in doing so, it's sort of, they had this huge space. They had like almost a full page. So what they've done is taken the terms, they've incorporated the Fair Appraisal Act Advisory, which is the FAAA form, and they just stuck it into this paragraph in the purchase agreement. So there's no longer that standalone form, the FAAA. I've had some people being like, I can't find it, and it doesn't exist. It's in the purchase agreement now, all incorporated. So,
Well, I'd like to show my age here, Lauren.
mhm.
When I started, it was 5 pages, the contract,
Oh my God. It was 8 when I started. So
and
you win.
it was carbon copied. So you
Mhm.
there
Yep.
was no forms, and you had to
Yep.
give the client a copy of the carbon copy.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I I have not been around as long as Don Kearney. Don Kearney started when the contract was half a page. No,
Oh my goodness.
I'm
Wow.
just joking. But it's crazy how things have changed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love the digital advancements that have been made just for, my own selfish business reasons. I remember starting out when everything was carbon copy and the statewide buyer and seller was only 10 pages then. But having to write the property address on the top of every single one of those pages before my agent had had an appointment with the seller, I hated it. So yeah, I love that. And anytime we can remove a form, I don't know that that's necessarily reduce the amount of pages or documents, but it's just one less form I guess we have to track. So um, for the compliance purposes, you may still see this field only because there are some contracts that maybe were by, for whatever reason, maybe haven't quite uploaded yet into SkySlope, but that were accepted before these changes. So that form may still be out there floating around for some transactions, but eventually that field will go away. Okay, now this little paragraph is in regards to a much bigger change that is coming in January of next year. And that is in regards to the wooden balconies and stairs and wooden elements law, basically. The forms committee decided to kind of roll this out now because if they waited for the December release, it may be too late to kind of prepare clients and listings because basically this law requires an inspection of these wood elements every 6 years, every 9 years if the property is in like a common interest development. But it doesn't apply to all transactions, only residential units, 3 or more units, or condos that are 3 or more units that are, again, that kind of common interest development. So this is where that quick guide comes in real handy because I mean, just as a transaction coordinator going into it, we're going to have no idea if this applies or doesn't, other than asking the agent who needs to know if they need to ask the client and, you know, trying to figure out what that all is going to look like. This is what the form looks like currently. Basically, the first paragraph describes applicability and, when the law is in effect and 6 years versus 9 years, all that kind of stuff. Paragraph 2 basically says what the requirements are. So if an inspection was prepared within the previous 6 years and it shows no issues, then the seller needs to provide the report to the buyer. If the report shows that repairs are needed, then they need to provide the report and evidence that the corrections or repairs have been made. Up until January 1st, so that's going to be like the requirements as of January 1st, 2025. Up until January 1st, 2025, just make a disclosure if no report has been made or repairs have been completed. But after that, sellers will need to provide a report. And I don't have in front of me, I think they'll probably go over it more in December on where these reports are coming from and who to call for a report. But I don't have that information at hand currently. So the seller property questionnaire has also been updated with these questions too, so that it's kind of one of those things of like, if you know, you know, and if you don't know, it's probably, doesn't apply. But again, this is only for 3 or more units that have wood elements. So not just like in general, it's like it has to have a wooden structure or element somehow as well. So great, love it. And then again, the last part just explains that it's only 9 years for this report that's required if it's in a common interest development. Okay, the purchase agreements also updated the terms around the notice to perform. This has closed the TC's favorite loophole. Essentially, if the notice is for multiple items, then the notice shall be valid for all contingencies and contractual actions for which the delivery of the notice is within the time permitted, which is very wordy, but basically saying that sometimes on the buyer side, we would maybe get a notice to perform that's due for another 3 days. So basically, this notice to perform is invalid. And now, and then we would need to get like a new notice to perform to apply to request only the specific ones that fall under the time frames. And now this is saying you don't need a new notice to perform. If you get a notice to perform that says all contingencies, but there's still one that it doesn't apply to, then that one, it's only invalid for that one contingency. All the other ones, the notice to perform still applies and is still valid, if that makes sense. They also added a clarification, again, to not use the notice to perform for the closing of escrow action. That has its own form. That's the demand to close. So you want closing of escrow. So then you would send a demand to close. Same thing with the seller. If this buyer's ready to close and the seller's not closing and keeps delaying or extending, then the buyer can also send a demand to close. So keep that in mind.
Lauren,
Yeah.
that I think is a good one to just note because I think that happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's basically been signed off by both sides, both parties, and
Mm-hmm.
for one reason or another, someone's not, at the closing table.
Mm-hmm.
The notice to perform is not, as Lauren's saying, is not the appropriate, form for that scenario.
Right. Yeah,
And so
exactly.
that happens probably more than it should, but I think people are more familiar with the notice to perform and not the demand to close. But the demand to close, obviously is the more appropriate, move at that point.
Right, right. And, especially because, well, I think I can jump to it here. This is the notice to perform. I see agents, you'll see here, there is no contractual action that they can check that is closing escrow. So, I always say one of the most dangerous elements on any of these forms for agents is a blank line that they can fill in because they will go down here to DD, check the box and write close of escrow. And that's just not, don't do that. That's not correct. So there's the demand to close that is specifically for closing escrow. This is for all the other, not just contingencies. There are all of these contractual actions that either buyer or seller have agreed to complete. Again, this is the buyer notice to perform. There is a seller notice to perform with the seller specific actions and contingencies. But returning a signed FHDS form, returning the lead disclosures. I mean, it breaks down. These are very micro. Again, a tool or a weapon, depending on how you want to utilize it. So, okay. Okay, let's see here. This section on 19D, this helps with the transparency regarding compensation. And you're going to see this change in verbiage in a lot of things. They've actually updated also the commission agreement to be the compensation agreement. They're trying to get rid of the word commission out of a lot of things. So compensation is the new term. Kind of like how we've changed landlord to housing provider. So you'll see those shifts. But this basically adds verbiage or escrow instruction that escrow will give the buyer a closing statement or other form of documentation showing the amount of compensation paid to the buyer's broker and the seller's broker. So, I see a lot of, I mean, again, and it says respectively, so the buyer, if they're not going to see the seller's agent's commission. It's only their own agent's commission that they would see from the breakdown. But again, this is in an effort for transparency and just something to keep in mind. I know traditionally it's been like, well, we don't share any commission instructions or anything with the buyer. Even if they're, if you're working with the buyer's agent, but this is kind of a small line. I don't know how necessarily it'll get implemented or rolled out. I don't know what escrow companies are doing with this aspect, or if it's something that they already do and now they've just put it into the contract. I don't know. But that's one of the updates that they've done in the form. Okay.
Albert says, I guess it's time for us to go back to school and get our law degree.
I mean, really, and that's kind of, slightly off topic, but one of the reasons why C.A.R delayed the rollout of their NAR settlement forms, the DOJ was like, this is so confusing. Really, the DOJ had received an older version of the forms and the updates. But even then, they were like, this doesn't help consumers at all because it is so convoluted and like it's crazy. And even just in my experience with other states as well, just seeing their contracts versus California, you really do need a law degree. It's pretty bonkers. Okay. This is another one that is not a big deal until it is. And probably one of the most overlooked sections of the contract, which is the definitions section. And you'll see section 25K, the definition for delivery has been updated. And essentially, it is considered in possession if it's located in the inbox for the applicable party or authorized agent. So how delivery worked previously, before this version of the contract rolled out, was that an item was considered electronically delivered once it hits the inbox of the person it was intended for. And that definition has been updated to mean that the document is considered delivered once it's been sent. And then it's considered in possession once it's in the inbox of that party, if that makes sense. So again, the default is that the electronic delivery is the default acceptable way to send a document, no longer in person, no longer in mail. You previously had to check a box to say we're going to deliver items electronically, and now they've gotten with the times a little bit and said, look, the default is going to be electronic delivery, and it's considered delivered when I send it. There's no more being like, oh, I didn't get the recipient, to check your spam folders to make sure that your email is operating and functional. This is that section for where agents sign. And so again, delivery is in effect once it's sent, not depending on whether it's in your inbox or what folder it's sent on. So you want to make sure that if the MLS auto-fills your emails, if you're a listing agent and your information's on MLS and agents use that and it gets auto-filled into contracts that they're sending to you, it'll automatically like a broker address or whatever, make sure that's the right email address. Because if it's not, then you need to fill in the correct email address in this line here where it says email above. Or if you want to change the option for delivery completely to being the old way for delivery, then you have to check the box and fill out that specific DITA form. So I understand that's extremely confusing, which it is for us as TCs as well, because this has flip-flopped back and forth a couple of times. I think now this is the way it should have been originally, of just like, look, whatever email address is here on the contract, that's what's going to get used. And if that needs to be different, so if you're a listing agent and you use like offers at blah blah blah, but that's not really the email inbox that you use during transactions, you need to make sure that this is going to be updated or correct. And again, in the same way that if you go on vacation or you're out sick or you switch, you have one of your team members take over for you in a transaction, you need to change who is going to be receiving the electronic delivery of contractual items, basically. Okay. Okay. So again, the notice to perform, we kind of touched on it a little bit. You'll see again here, they updated just the insurance aspect of being standalone. Again, keep in mind, if all contingencies is selected, the notice to perform will be valid for all contingencies, which the delivery of this notice is within that time permitted. So they wrote that in here in this bold paragraph. Usually reads that top section, but just keep in mind, it kind of reiterates that statement there. Okay, the other one is the woo form, the poor woo form. It's the most fun form to say. And reformatted it to become more useful, more applicable. Previously, it was just withdrawal of offer, and it was just for a buyer to withdraw an offer. But now they've kind of expanded the options that you can use this form for. It can be used by buyer or seller. And it can be used to withdraw not just a purchase agreement, but counter offers, requests for repair, amendments, and so this can be really useful. It is one additional document, but I think it helps in clarity and tracking of documentation. So if you have a repair request and then you want to submit a different version, or the traditional sense of, oh, hey, we sent a seller counteroffer and submit a multiple counteroffer, you would use this form. Again, it has to be prior to something being fully executed. So keep that in mind. You can't give a seller counteroffer, the buyer signs it, and then you withdraw that counteroffer and give them a multiple counter. You can't do that. It has to be like before the buyer has signed off on that counteroffer.
What about if you write an offer, right? I think the default is what, 72 hours?
Yeah.
72 hours passes, right? This happens
Mm-hmm.
to everybody. I know it does.
Mm-hmm.
You write the offer and they say, oh, we're not going to review offers till Monday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously they have all these offers floating around, right? And technically they expire, right? I
Yeah.
write the offer today, by
Mm-hmm.
Saturday it's expired, right?
Mm-hmm.
would you still, or do they still want people to use this form even though the offer has technically expired?
Well, there's two aspects to that. First, that from what I've understood in talking with the C.A.R attorneys, is that um, if both parties continue to move forward in good faith, then you have this sort of non-written understanding. So like if, for example, you see sometimes there'll be a cancellation that gets issued, and a cancellation of contract doesn't require both signatures. It's unilateral cancellation. And then they reconcile or they figure something out, and then they're like, oh, we're just going to ignore that and like continue on with the transaction. Like, yes, you should get an addendum saying that that's removed, but if both parties continue on, then there is this understanding that they are both acting with the understanding that the transaction is continuing. So I would encourage the agent doing the counter to extend the response time. And I would also encourage the agent writing the offer to have the conversation with the listing agent too of when are you reviewing offers, and maybe get in the habit of extending that time frame. I don't know necessarily in this market if there's a benefit to having a shorter response time from a seller. Um, that's usually probably more in a buyer's market, that
Well,
tool of like, hey, let me know or move on to the next property.
yeah,
Um,
but what I
so
see
yeah,
is agents do write those short, they know the property is going to get multiple offers. So they may have an incredible over asking offer, but they want to get the seller to commit,
right,
before they have a stack of 15, right?
right.
And so that's where I see these,
Shorten
time
time frame.
periods shrunk
Yeah,
down to, 24 hours essentially, or something like that.
yeah, 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 yeah. Um, I don't know. I don't have a specific answer for that. That's probably a car legal.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right about this, the intent. I mean, if
Yeah,
if parties are still, even if the dates are not basically matched up, but they're still, obviously negotiating and signing documents, obviously that interpretation of that is, yeah, I mean, you can't really use that as an out,
yeah,
but I do think if you, are, this form is very good to make it very clear and overly redundant and clear that, you're basically not offering certain things, or you're pulling something back.
right, right. Exactly. Okay, so those were, well, essentially the end of my slideshow in a sense of what I was able to pull together. But I'm going to share with you some of the drafts. I don't necessarily have notes on the slides of these items, so we'll just kind of go over it. It won't be a pretty display, but we'll kind of work with what's in the basket here on some of these forms that have some of the smaller tweaks that we want to touch on. So let me switch screen shares. Okay. And okay, so we have the SPQ, which we uh, previously in as wooden structures and balconies and things like that. But there are a couple of other changes that they've made, or updates to the form. So this is one that is probably a good idea to use the most recent version. So if you have a listing where the seller's done the disclosures already, And it hasn't maybe gone into escrow yet, I would have them do a new SPQ and probably TDS. The TDS doesn't have too much of a big change. But basically, this section up here in the top asks about question K about if there's any inspections done for that balconies, stairways, wood thing structures. They've also expanded out this section 7E in regards to lead-based paint and kind of broke it down into smaller questions and more specific questions. And then item F here addresses what a lot of people are referencing as the flipper law, but I feel like that's really misleading because it is not just for investors purchasing property with the intent to flip it for a profit. It is anybody that has offer and is now selling it. So that could be, maybe people have purchased a property and gotten divorced. Maybe they've had to relocate for work. Maybe, whatever. There's a myriad of reasons that are not necessarily wanting to flip the property. The other thing to keep in mind is that this law is tied to the TDS law, essentially, in that if a seller is exempt from the TDS, then they are going to be exempt from the SPQ as well in the contract, so they wouldn't have to provide this information. So I know a lot of people are thinking like, well, successor trustee, they inherit the property and then they go to sell it. They have no idea. Like, it doesn't apply to them because they are exempt from this aspect of disclosure. But for everybody else, they need to provide, if there's been any reports, changes. This is all fairly standard as far as disclosure goes, but it's just putting into writing that the buyer needs copies and also contact information for the people that did the repairs. So there's going to be additional documentation and information gathering that's required. And so this section also kind of asks the seller to provide that information. Section 8 in here, this talks about ADU, and this is going to be really helpful and important because section E, essentially, a lot of people are using the term ADU when a property isn't actually an accessory dwelling unit. It is considered an ADU when it has government or city approval, essentially. And so sometimes people build or convert their own and then call it an ADU, but it's not really. So these questions ask the seller, is it actually permitted? Is there actual approval? And then it also asks about the presence of the solar system, and incorporates that solar form disclosure into the transaction as well, because that is another one that is important. And then, of course, any other material facts for the property that are not otherwise disclosed, they just added this additional question in the transaction. The other thing, too, that they've added, I don't know why it's blue and not red, but they've added whether the property is tenant occupied, and if it was previously occupied by the tenant, and even if it's vacant now, they want to know how the tenancy ended, because the buyer could now be inheriting either liability or drama or
a squatter.
and the buyer doesn't know how the last person left. Maybe, yeah, like they don't know necessarily what the situation is. So this is one of those questions that's really important. And so they've added this again into the SPQ. The other thing that they have updated, I'll just show you here, the TDS, because there are a lot of corporations that are selling properties so the TDS is statutory, that is state required. The SPQ is contractual. And the contract says if a seller is exempt from the TDS, they don't have to provide a TDS. And instead of having to give us contractually a full SPQ, they only have to give us the exempt seller disclosure instead. So that's typically what happens. A lot of people think the ESD or exempt seller disclosure replaces the TDS, but it actually replaces the SPQ and the TDS is no longer required. So I say that because a lot of these corporations, because the SPQ is contractual, a lot of these bigger corporations will counter it out or not make it part of their contract. So they don't necessarily, you don't need an SPQ in a transaction that is contractual. And so they will get rid of the SPQ or the ESD in a transaction, but they'll still be required to provide a TDS. And so because of that, they have still added this sort of block on the TDS to remind these corporations or companies or people that have countered out the SPQ that they still are required to provide, again, if it's been within 18 months that they have received title, they're still required to provide this information to the buyer. It's not like a yes or no question, but it's like a, can't really miss it. We're going to put it here so you can't skip over it. Okay. The AOAA form just has a little update that the buyer is not receiving compensation for the assignment as the default. It used to be that you'd have to check the box every time. And so now they just updated it that that is the default, that the buyer is not receiving any compensation. Easy peasy. The Avid, a lot of people have maybe seen already, they took out of the top section where it talks about the weather and who is present up here on page 2. And they moved it to the bottom section here. So this is the person filling out the agent visual. It still needs to be a licensee under the same brokerage. Doesn't necessarily have to be the agent. All of that information gets filled out here. And then the buyer signs it. And again, they just reiterated that the agent on the other side and the seller, they can acknowledge receipt, but they don't necessarily have to initial or sign it to make it valid or completed.
And this is our chance to remind everybody how important the Avid is. Because Lauren and I know this very well. When the CDAs are requested, the number one thing is probably not done, and I'm sure you agree, is probably the Avid. And so when I sell properties, I typically get this done straight away as I'm taking the listing or doing my initial review of the property, exterior, interior, garage, etc. I get this out of the way. Get this done early in your listing or your transaction. Don't let this be a trailing thing, because this is not something you want to do the day before close of escrow or you're waiting for your CDA. Go there when the property is fresh in your mind. Knock it out. Make sure you put substantive, descriptive things. You're not trying to kill the deal, but you're trying to cover your ass. And so, especially really like things to me like obvious heavy termite damage or wood rot or things that are or stains, water stains, things that can just come back and be a big nightmare. This is your chance to put it down and put it there to cover yourself, because nobody wants to have themselves in an arbitration mediation over something that you could have easily taken care of. And it really has a good function. They're not expecting you to move furniture around. Obviously, you're not supposed to crawl up in the attic, but you're supposed to be able to recognize as a professional certain things. And leaving a blank Avid to me is just not the sign of somebody who's their insurance on themselves is not a policy is pretty much not there.
Yeah, exactly. The C.A.R attorney advice is always no items to note for each section. They have also added an additional bedroom and additional bath for agents as well. I always recommend, if you can, do your Avid through Glide, because you can do it on your phone and then you can take a picture of each item. And my thought as the TC, when I am, looking at it from a risk management perspective, is always assessing a file and documentation 5 to 7 years from now in a courtroom in front of a judge. And if you pull up your agent visual and there's nothing on here except at the bottom where you say, agent recommends buyer does their own inspections. Okay, cool. How does that tell me, one, you were at the property, and two, like, there's nothing here that's going to refresh your memory of like, hey, maybe bath one is Jack and Jill, or some kind of like, other note that will help you orient on the condition of the property and what you saw visually while you were there. The other thing too to note and remember is that the Avid is essentially a add-on to the TDS. So the agents are legally required to perform a visual inspection. So one, if the seller is exempt from the TDS, you're absolutely going to need to provide the Avid. And two, when you receive disclosures from maybe the listing side and you have everything except the listing agent's Avid, you don't have a completed TDS. And I'll show you here on the RPA. They keep moving all of these sections of what is considered complete. Section 5. So the real estate transfer disclosure statement is considered fully completed if the seller's completed the section titled coordination with other disclosure forms. So basically section 1. Sellers completed and answered all questions and signed seller's information section in section 2. And the seller's agent, if any, has completed and signed seller's agent section 3, or if applicable, an agent visual inspection disclosure. So if they have checked, if applicable, see Avid, and they don't give you an Avid, then the TDS is not considered fully completed. Keep that in mind, again, when we're talking about timeframes and disclosures and contingencies and timelines, and you're like, oh, on the listing side, and your buyer has a 5-day inspection contingency or investigation contingency, and to remove the disclosures, but you haven't done your Avid, keep that in mind. This, again, a tool or a weapon, depending on the situation. So
That's a big one.
Do your Avid.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big one. Good point.
Okay. The Avid, the COP form.
Yeah, let's fly through these last ones. I don't want to I mean, and you're doing a great job, but I don't want to keep everyone here for,
Yeah.
you
Sorry.
know,
I'll
it's
go
all
quick
good.
through these.
I know it's your
I could talk on this stuff forever. So the COP form, they just added an actual close of escrow date because again, there used to not be one, and it was kind of like we need something a little bit more solid. So that's the COP form. The probate purchase agreement addendum, they have added the option for a different type of probate proceeding. Basically, also gives the buyer the right to return to get their deposit back if their bid is not confirmed by the court for a reason other than not the buyer's fault. So again, if you do probate a lot, know that there is that option for the buyer to get their deposit back. And again, if a property is not an estate, conservatorship, guardianship, receivership, you can always check other, but we all know how I feel about blank other boxes. Okay. And then the probate listing addendum, same thing. They added a box for other. Statewide buyer and seller advisory. This part, they added a whole other section on the wood balconies and disclosures area. And then, let's see here, about tenant occupancy as well. They updated a section in here on that, which again, I don't know how many agents sit with their buyers, even their sellers too, on like all of this information. But it's a lot and it touches on everything. So again, when we're talking about short time frames and you want your buyers to really go through and understand what they're signing off on and what they're aware of and not aware of, be nice to them and give them some time to read this stuff because it's a lot. The single party compensation agreement. This part, they where is my note on that? They just added a section to conform to the listing agreements in the same way that the agency aspect and agency disclosure. This is when there's no listing agreement in place and it's just, again, the single party compensation, but it does incorporate that other agency aspect. And then the septic propane paragraph modified to the default position so that the propane remaining in the tank is given to the buyer. They've also, I don't know, for whatever reason, we're not in like a big heavy septic area or propane area. But apparently there was a lot of issues with what happens with the propane that's left in the tank.
Yeah,
So they just added that it conveys at no cost.
I'm taking that.
Final walkthrough, they added but maybe the agent can do the walkthrough on the buyer's behalf. You would essentially note who is doing this final walkthrough. Sometimes you have to do it over video or something like that. The buyer is not able to be present. A lot of times previously it would be like, well, then the buyer's waiving their right to do their actual inspection. Now, if the buyer's okay with their agent walking through on a video call or something, then the agent would fill out this portion. Both parties, again, would still have to sign like, yes, that's true. I don't think that there's any other issues. That's fine. But they added that section, which is helpful. And then the WCMD form is just a tiny added sentence to advise the buyer to investigate the cost of bringing any non-compliant water fixtures into compliance before removing their investigation contingency. So again, if there is a retrofit requirement, a lot of the, LA, city of LA and surrounding areas, they require a retrofit. There's always this option of like, oh, well, the buyer will just assume the violations or they'll take care of it after closing or whatever that situation may be. But there's this added little sentence that it was like, well, it may be really expensive and you may, make sure that you're okay with those costs before you remove the investigation contingency. So,
And just a note to that, Lauren, I think if you're having your physical inspection, it would probably be a good time if you've got a good solid, person that understands, these types of costs. You can probably get that information out from the home inspector.
Yeah, yeah. And then two final ones that I wanted to the TOPA form, the tenant occupied property addendum, added this section for a cap on buyers out of pocket expenses. Essentially, if the seller cannot get the tenant out of the property, if they're not able to get them out previously, then the buyer could request reasonable out of pocket expenses for inspections and appraisals and things like that. But now you can check a box and cap that cost. So again, if you're on the buyer side, keep an eye out for this checkbox that may limit how much the buyer can receive from the seller if the seller cancels based on not being able to get the tenant out per this agreement. Keep that in mind. And then the final one is the residential lease. So there is the new law that came into effect July 1st about caps on security deposits. It cannot be more than 1 month's rent for the security deposit unless it is considered like a mom and pop kind of small owner or like natural person, like a small landlord or housing provider, would be exempt from this 1 month cap if they're a natural person, or if all members, excuse me, all members of an LLC are natural persons, and if the landlord owns no more than 2 residential properties that include more than 4 dwelling units. There's like these certain exemptions basically. And then the
Does
housing provider can request an exemption.
does that revert back to what it was previously?
No, then it makes it they're allowed to collect 2 months instead of 1 month. And then
And
if the
and if it was furnished,
doesn't matter.
it's just still 2 months max.
Yeah.
If
Yep.
you're a mom pop.
Correct. And so that's like if you own your own property and then you own a rental single family home and then maybe you own a triplex, then you fall under that like small landlord. But if your tenant is an active or reserve military member, they can now counter your exemption and fill out their own form that basically is an exemption to the exemption, and then you're back to only being able to collect 1 month when it comes to active or reserve military members. So keep that in mind. There is this additional new form that they have for that, which is this disclosure and addendum. And this is if they're enacting the exemption, and then this is if the tenant responds with an exemption of their own to that previous exemption. So that's what those new forms look like. There's so much more that we didn't get to cover today. We're going to touch base in 2 weeks on the 24th. And we'll go over the listing agreement changes, the compensation changes, everything that C.A.R is going to be rolling out. Again, I encourage you to go onto car.org and check out what they've just rolled out. I didn't even get a chance to look at it at all this morning yet. But look over those changes. If you have anything, any questions about stuff that we didn't touch on today, and maybe we won't touch on in 2 weeks, feel free to reach out to me or to Bill, and we can help you as best we can.
Yeah, and I have there was a question in the beginning from Don Kearney. He said he had heard the forms have been put off to August 15th. Is yes or no? Is that I presume he's referring to the buyer agreement and all those changes. Is that the date that you've heard, or is that you're not sure?
Yes. So let me. Okay. So the forms that they're coming out with, they're going to be in full compliance by August 17th. So they're releasing these new final forms on July 24th, which is when we'll have our next webinar, essentially to get people used to using them and so that they will come out prior to August 17th. I think August 17th is also the deadline for a lot of MLSs as well. The NAR member owned MLSs to remove the compensation aspect from their MLS. And let me see here.
I'm sorry, what did you say the date was to they're going to remove that field?
Each MLS is different. I feel like I made a date. C.A.R. MLS, their rule change is August 13th. So effective August 13th, C.A.R. MLS will no longer have the compensation, cooperating broker compensation fields available for new listings. If you have a listing that is in there currently up until that date, the compensation will continue to be displayed. This is from whatever their webinar was that we attended. And if you have maybe something after that that had gone into escrow and then canceled and went back as a listing, my understanding is that compensation would also still be displayed, but any new entries would be
Yeah, the field wouldn't be
yeah,
there.
yeah, it
And
wouldn't fly.
that makes sense.
Yeah. So and then yeah, because I feel like there's still um
Gonna be a little bit of a adjustment for sure.
yeah. Um I feel like September is the deadline for the NAR settlement, like confirmation. Let me pull up okay. August, August 13th is a C.A.R. MLS when those forms, I don't know about the other MLSs, but C.A.R. MLS will be August 13th. August 17th, NAR's rules will go into effect relating to the MLS and buyer agent, buyer broker agreements. September 16th is the non-realtor MLS deadline for those that opted in to update their platforms because they gave them that option. And then November 26th is when the NAR settlement's final approval is scheduled. So we're doing all of this stuff way in advance, and the settlement isn't even like finalized or official until November 26th.
Well,
So
what that tells me is that they're pretty sure the way this
yeah,
thing's gonna end up.
yeah,
They're
yep,
just buttoning it up.
yep, yep. And
So
or if anything, they can go look at this chaos that this has caused. Let's, make
yeah,
these adjustments
yeah,
prior to November 26th. So,
yeah.
because yeah, I don't want to cause panic, but it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a
Yeah.
complete shift and change in the way that everybody is operating, and it's going to be bumpy and messy and difficult, but it's going to be nothing that we can't handle. And just as long as everybody takes the initiative, if you're really serious about this as your profession, you have to understand these documents and how to utilize them for your own best interest and your client's best interest. And if you understand the documents that you're working with, you're going to be fine.
I could not have said that better myself. Lauren, as always appreciate your insight. Uh, for you agents, this is kind of my really reminder. If you have TCs that you're using, that they are too up to speed on this stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
if not, you might want to consider changing TCs because it's only getting more complicated. And if they're not up to date on these forms and the changes, it's going to impact your business. And that's a big deal. And I want to also remind everybody, especially our new agents, if you do not have TC that's licensed, certified forms trainer, and all the above, everything like Lauren is. She's a great resource for you, and we will put her information down in the replay. That's another point. We do record all these webinars, so you can go back and listen to it again. Maybe there was a part that we went through that needs to be heard again, and this is a great resource. But Lauren runs TC Advantage. She's also our compliance file review officer. And so, what better way to get your CDAs out quick and fast if you don't have somebody that's, just like Lauren just said, you're being serious about your business. Well, the TCs need to be serious about their business too. They're a huge asset, but if they're not up to speed with this stuff, we see it all the time. Things happen, and it's It's like, why are we paying $500 for that?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's,
Anyways,
you've seen multiple scenarios of a small checkbox can have a big effect on people's money, and nobody wants their money messed with. So
no. So thank you again, Lauren. We will be back in 2 weeks. We will go through part two. We'll get more probably in depth on the NAR stuff, those changes, because that's obviously going to change how we do business. And so we'll be prepared for that in 2 weeks. In the meantime, we'll hope Kevin recovers well, and we'll be back next Wednesday. I think we're going to have DJ Bibb on. I will confirm that with Fidelity and that awesome new AI video product he has with listings. It sounds like it's really cool, and he has not launched it to any other brokerage. So we're getting first crack at it. So I encourage everybody to be on next week. And as Kevin always says, let's make it a great week. Let's make it a productive week. And we will see everybody next Wednesday. Take care.